we've talked ad infinitum about the office workspace and so on, and transforming spaces. And I don't think we're any wiser now than we were about 6 weeks ago. We've had an AV Works conference on the thing. We had a long talk, of which very kindly Joe was a member of my crew. We talked about the end user protections and what was facing everybody trying to create these workspaces, and it's been sort of relatively inconclusive. And what we need really are chatting to the experts who can give us a bit of advice about steps forward. And the most obvious starting question seemed to me is the office dead? But what do you think? Can I kick off with you, Mr. Andrew? Is it Lazaroff or Lazaro?
Lazaro. Well,
Lazaro.
Technically both are correct. Originally it was Lazaroff, and then once they emigrated to the US, it became Lazaro.
I'm sure there's a big tale there. We'll have to find out later. It sounds fascinating.
But yeah, a lot of you don't know me. None of you actually know me. So my background before joining ESI is I come from a theater and live performance background. So I was designing new plays and musicals on Broadway. I did some work for retailers on Savile Row in the UK, but mainly my background was theater and live performance, and the idea of storytelling in a place. And as many of you probably know, theater has the question of is theater dead has been asked decade after decade, constantly, with every pandemic, with every problem like this. Theater sort of sits down and says, are we dead? And then somebody reinvents it just enough and finds the thing that makes it unique, and it stayed with us for thousands of years for a reason. And in short, I think The Office is a similar thing. I think this is a major question moment to say, what makes The Office unique? What makes in-person unique? What sort, like, we talk about collaboration vaguely, but not all collaboration actually benefits from being in the same room together in person. So for example, I think, there are ways of building up ideas that with tools like Mural or different digital tools, it's easier to actually do from home. But I think the serendipity of chance is something you can't replicate in the at-home workspace. And I think the almost Hegelian dialectic, right? Like, not that A fights with B and you always get a positive C, but if I disagree with Lindsay, for example, and Vince disagrees with both of us, it's almost impossible over Slack or even over Zoom to convince each other in the same way. Whereas I think that in-person collaboration of like hashing ideas out and building to something none of us ever would have thought of on our own, that's where Lindsay and Vince and I would suddenly come up with this new idea we never would have. So I don't think The Office is dead, but I think we need to identify what about it is unique and special, and then as designers come together to lift that thing up.
How do you go about that then? What process do you set in motion to try and answer those questions?
Yeah, I think it depends on company to company and corporate culture versus corporate culture. We do a lot of design for Barclays Bank. So we did, the Barclays Center, we do their digital content in Brooklyn and that on the outside. And then we do the facade of the building in Times Square. But that workspace is very different, right? You're usually very siloed, and though traders work together, their day-to-day moment, it's usually about speed and efficiency. So it's about how do you lift that corporate culture so they feel like they're on the same team, even if the day-to-day work is typically in an individual basis. Whereas another company we recently did work for, Warner Media, the parent company of TBS and TNT and CNN and Warner Brothers. And we're doing Warner Brothers Studio in Burbank right now. And that is very much about how do you bring people together? How do you create spaces where people from different departments might cross-pollinate and people from different properties might cross-pollinate and build each other in a way. And then one of the things we're looking at as well is, redesigning the conference room in a way so that it is easier for debates to happen. So actually, for us, we're looking in most spaces at actually taking obvious digital tools out, but playing with elements like, touch reactive or projection mapping so that, you could track an idea and move it across, or scan something and send it to a team member who the next day might be working from home, but you still get those benefits of in-person back and forth.
So are you saying that we're just redefining radically what the office is there for and what it should be delivering, or is it a much bigger thought process than that? I mean, bearing in mind that Microsoft and Dropbox a few days ago said they were putting remote working was a permanent thing for them. It's followed a number of people. I mean, how have they gone about? I mean, Vince raised this, didn't you? You were talking about how the office and the hybrid between the office and working from home was going to develop, and was that a thinking people were having, and how the two work together? Seems to be quite a gulf between this is the office, and from what I've gathered, if few employees so far have had much help setting up the home environment, it's just a laptop in the kitchen, whereas now we're approaching a much more closer fusion between the working environment and the home environment, which the two are interlocked in my view, always have been, but we're not looking at that in a formal way. So from a design architecture point of view and a fit out point of view, in fact, is this something on people's agendas now, or is that a nice to have and people may well be thinking about it? Vince?
I think to pick up on the very first question, is the office dead? No, it's not. And I'd like to think we all believe in that in some way, shape or form. But to answer your question, it's high on everyone's agenda. But I think you hit the nail on the head, Clive, that we just don't know. We didn't know 6 weeks ago. We don't know today. We might not know in 6 months what the office of the future will look like. I believe it's going to be sector driven. Different occupiers have different needs. But in my view, there will be some kind of hybrid of what that office of the future looks like. I don't think we're going to be jam-packed like we have been for the last few years. I don't think we're all going to be at home. That hybrid is yet to discover itself. But what I can say, certainly from the clients I talk to and my colleagues, every occupier is different. And the rise of workplace analysis it's always been there for the last few years, but it's really kind of risen the ranks recently to try and get to that answer, but no one really has it yet. I was on a UK call this morning with a lot of my other kind of colleagues, and we've got a lot of occupiers that are re-gearing their leases. We've got a lot of occupiers that are extending where they are and not embarking on new capital projects because they don't know. They don't know where they're going to be in 6 months, 12 months. Some of the stats I was hearing this morning were like, we'll get to some form of new normal at the end of 22. That's a long time to not really know what the office looks like. So I think we are in a kind of reactive phase still at the minute. But what do we do about it? Well, it takes kind of audiences like this to be innovative and plan for two things. Plan for the here and now, but then, what is the office of the future? But that's a few years down the line.
Yeah, I've been writing articles about office of the future since the 80s. I mean, it's basic automation, wasn't it? I mean, office of the future, documentless office or whatever you want to call it, You're right, reactionary, I suppose, in a sense. The sort of things we touched upon was how ill-prepared people were working from home anyway, and that, there was no IT robustness about the whole process anyway, just for basic functions, let alone anything else. But companies really hadn't given any kind of help or authority, even our own hadn't, funnily enough, about help to set up even the basics at home, because the home isn't a working environment. Do people want to turn that home into a working environment or keep it as a home? This is always the dilemma, isn't it? So no matter how much you want to keep your office employees at home, then the problem is there isn't really a professional working environment currently in the home, regardless of what company you're in.
Just to pick up on that, I think it's a really important kind of factor, and we kind of get into away from more kind of AV and office, but more into the softer aspect of this, effects on different demographics. Various research that we've seen suggests that let's call it, the more experienced generations, they've got a bit of a different standard of life outside of London. Maybe they've got that spare room they can turn into an office. Whereas the younger generation, they're kind of perched at the kitchen counter in a house share in the middle of London. And that comes with it all sorts of different well-being factors as well. And I don't want to tread on Amy's toes because I know that she's passionate about this. But this is a real issue. It kind of, you've got the kind of hard and kind of fixed aspects of this, then the softer ones, which are just, that's where the damage is really going to be done.
I completely agree. It's
on,
especially that research you're talking about, Vince. I've seen the same thing, that sort of 35 and over, when you're a bit more established, possibly got a bit more room in your home, working from home is beneficial, and a lot of people have really taken to it and don't want to go back to the office full time, or want to keep that flexibility in their arrangement. But the younger sort of generation that are still trying to establish themselves, are living in those shared environments, not only is that difficult to work in from a concentration and a productivity point of view, it's also really damaging to people's mental health. And actually, what we were saying about the office not necessarily being dead, but certainly changing, we will always need human interaction. As humans, it's part of what we want, what we need, what we crave. And yes, we can do things virtually, and yes, things are being done virtually, and you have to think about how you're doing those to make sure they're impactful and they're engaging. But there will always be a need for some form of space, whether you create that community virtually or whether you adapt what you're doing in the office to make it a more hybrid model, as Vince and Andrew have both been saying. But it is important to make sure that even though you're not seeing your staff every day necessarily in the office in person, that you're still reaching out to those people, using the great technologies that we have available to us now, but you're asking those critical questions about, are you okay? How is your mental health? Are you struggling with anything? Because for the first time in a lot of our lifetimes, this is the first time we've had anything that we're all experiencing at the same time on such a global scale. And it has affected everyone, and people who have never struggled with mental health or struggled with communicating with their team or staying in touch with people or feelings of isolation. Even people that have never struggled with that before are struggling on some level now, whether it's juggling their responsibilities at home or learning to use new technologies that they haven't had to use before, or adapting their working processes to work with those new technologies. It's a new experience for everyone. And like Finn said earlier, we're all trying to work out what the best way to do that is, and we don't know what the future is going to hold, but it's finding ways of making sure that decisions you're making around technologies now and the workplace now are taking into account people's whole selves, that sort of holistic view of your employees, and saying, okay, if we're not going back to the office full time, but we're making it a hybrid environment, are we providing the same level of productivity tools and interaction tools for people that are working from the home as we are for people that are working in the office?
What sort of interaction tools are you referring to, Amy?
So down to the very basic, what we're using today, video technologies, making sure that the video quality that people are getting at home is the same as in the office, but also the confidence around any new technologies that have maybe been put in place into people's homes to make it easier for them to communicate, that people have the confidence to use that, and that they're being rolled out with training, and the end users are being involved in that initial process of, what do you want? What would make your working day easier? Or this working process that's been disrupted because you're now no longer in the same room, is there something that would allow you to continue to work at the level of productivity you work in the office when you're remote?
I mean, one would like to think that is happening, isn't it, really? But I have to say, within our own company, HR were the first to jump into this with a wellbeing program, being quite concerned that people out on the limb, both those being furloughed and those officially employed, would need some help coping psychologically with the situation they were thrust into. The technical support, even now, is only just being rolled out a bit, and there's still no, even we have a CTO, there's still not a lot of proper formal thought about helping people set up and cope. Awful lot of, even with the well-being advice, there was an awful lot of assumption that people were already digitally literate to be able to cope with various bits. They'd set stuff off. It's mostly an approach of common sense that would allow people to just get on with it. And in fact, the area that they don't normally tackle, which is this well-being aspect, the more human elements, which is always something up and down in the management of people we have now, even in the office, was something that they really spotted could be a problem, but the sort of technology took a back seat. They were just, oh, well, it's a portable, plug it in, and off you go. You know, so it's balanced now. Well-being is now coming up much more to that level, isn't it? But technology has sort of been uppermost, but hasn't been tackled in the way we would have liked. I mean, things have been happening so fast, has been said, you know. It's still very much a reactionary phase.
And I think a lot of people have put technology, like you say, in 6 months ago when we needed something quickly and something that worked. And then they haven't reviewed that and just made sure, is that the right tool for my team and for what they're trying to do? And are they aware of the full functionality they have available to them, and are they using it? Because a lot of people are using video tools and are just using it for basic video conferencing, but don't know about how to break off into different breakout rooms or how to share presentations. Or, I mean, being in the technology industry, I think we have a sort of head start, and we feel that everyone would have that level of knowledge. But actually, does everyone, from the person that's doing the accounts to the salespeople to, you know, the entire organization, is everyone that comfortable with using these tools, and have they been offered the help to use them to their full capabilities?
We'll go on to technology later. Darren, just coming to you, really. I mean, I know your clients, you have a number of clients in the higher education sphere. I mean, you're very much the sharp end of the minute. I mean, there's a hell of a lot going on in higher education at the moment, especially now that people are now going back to college. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like in AV trying to cope with the immense, I mean, the higher education sector has always had a fast change environment to cope with, hasn't it? But how the hell are they coping at the moment?
Oh, it's a mixed bag really at the moment. I think from organisation to organisation, some of our clients are sort of still creating spaces that have, you know, that collaborative element, but obviously some clients are also holding up complete building projects because of the majority of spaces were actually revolved around the collaboration element. And touching upon some of the points earlier with regards to, you know, the sort of working together part still, you know, and the unknown really is very much apparent with some of the organisations that we're working with. Obviously, a lot of the lectures, I think, in majority of the organisation from the higher ed organisations are all still on an online basis. But there's still that sort of very much mixed bag between some of the organisations, which is interesting. I just wanted to touch upon the point that was made earlier as well within the sort of mental health side of things, and you know, some households and some environments not necessarily having the sort of appropriate office space and things like that. One of the points I think that was fundamental really is that separation between work and your home life as well. Obviously, you know, if you do live in a small shared space, then, you know, your personal space is then turned into your office. So then at what point do you actually, you know, separate yourself from work? You know, it gets to 5 or 6 o'clock and you think, well, I've still got quite a lot to do, so I'll just carry on, you know, as opposed to if you were in the office, it'll get to 5 or 6 o'clock and you'll be like, well, I really need to go now. And then at that point, then you can shut your mind off. So I just thought that was quite a, you know, sort of quite a fundamental point to maybe bring up as well. But yeah, to sort of run back into the AV side of things, it's been very much a mixed bag. I mean, we're looking at various different solutions now, from sort of gesture control and touchless, you know, sort of systems within meeting spaces as well, to sort of bring that element to continue, but obviously still with the whole pandemic scenario in hand as well, you know. So
it's funny actually. Is touchless now like to be more demand, and is it achievable?
Yeah, it is, and there is various companies out there at the moment that are putting quite a lot of R&D into that space as well, to sort of, you know, bring that into the environment, if you like, as an option, you know, sort of embedded in within code. So you can sort of come along and use your own device as the control surface, or, you know, there is also the opportunity now to sort of walk into spaces and rely on occupancy sensors to know that you're there, for example. And then at that point, then the auto switching switches onto the device that you need, and at that point, then you're automatically into the call if you're on another call at that particular point. So there is various technologies that are out there and always now being developed, and even more now with the scenario that we're in, very much being developed, and the main focus for some of these companies out there.
Is voice and audio going to be more of a thing within these environments now, or is that quite a complex equation to try and think about? I mean, certainly working from home, my biggest problem is getting the audio right.
Yeah.
I can imagine how other people are wondering about acoustics and God knows what else, and just getting the. I mean, vision's a thing you can see instantly, but audio is always. Even the top dogs are getting it wrong, you know.
Yeah,
so I
absolutely.
So coming from within the environment, plus the contact environment as well, to help you do things and really sort of control function.
Yeah, it's an interesting point really to sort of touch on that one, with especially with the way that everybody's now been enforced into the whole working from home scenario, with obviously audio and video. It does seem to a point where the expectation of the quality has sort of lapsed slightly, if that makes sense. So
really,
obviously from a home environment, but obviously when you go back into the conference spaces and things like that, obviously things will be different. But there seems to be that, you know, the calls that people are on, that sometimes there's not that much of too much of a high expectation to get your, you know, higher quality audio and video on some of the calls, because, you know, as long as you're getting the point across, I think that's fine. But obviously once you get into your, you know, back into your conference spaces and meeting spaces and things like that, then obviously, it's very much a demand that's still there. But it's just a way of being able to adapt the technology in order to, you know, keep these spaces running, but also, you know, make sure that we're still abiding by some of the regulations that are now upon us, really.
Joe, you know, can you give us an update what's happening at Google? I mean, what are you doing with staff? You've got them working at home, and is there a remote policy going on? How are you handling what? Because, you know, you're a perfect example of your research and your ongoing working with spaces was a little ahead of everybody else, really. I mean, you introduce flexibility into your working environments. You know, only use what you need type stuff, and if it's not appropriate, change it around and be flexible enough to what people want to use that space for. Quite early on, it's proved probably now to be extremely effective, I'd have thought. What have we learned through it all, and where are you?
I guess it's part of that is we're now just realizing how little we knew about all of those things, even though we thought we'd been thinking about them for a long time, but we're realizing that we hadn't thought enough about them. But, you know, I think there are some parts that we had reasonably well solved. You know, distributed collaboration, we've been doing that for a long time. You know, meeting on video, that's perfectly normal. And you know, we already had an AV engineering team, so when people go to work from home and they need advice on how to make video at home work well, you know, we have a team of engineers who can help them optimize that, and that's great. So we could turn some of those things on quite quickly, but then it's some of those softer things that other people have mentioned that are still coming up, because the culture at Google is very much around the place. It's, you know, the office I work in, I don't know if some of you have been there in Pancras Square. The only things that are fixed mostly are some of the meeting rooms and the places where we get food, and everything else can be moved around, because that was what's important. you can move desk. People don't really mind about that. You can move meeting room. But what's important is being able to have coffee with somebody, or have lunch with them. And so we're finding that once we take those things away, those are the things we didn't really have solved in any other way. Is that let's have a chat over coffee kind of question. And so what we're seeing is the office becomes it was a number of things, and we can do individual work, whether it's on video or on docs or whatever, can be done somewhere else, assuming you have that spare room or you have that office you can work from, which some people don't. But that collaboration piece where you want to be in the same space, well, maybe we've got some technology that can help us there as well, and we're kind of working through options of is it useful to have bigger screens or more cameras or better lighting and all that kind of stuff. What's still very much up for discussion is, well, what about the reason that we work together so well is because we also had lunch together, and that's why we can thrash out a difficult issue in an hour as opposed to all afternoon, is because we've got maybe kind of quite high psychological safety in the team. So how do you build that when everybody's very distributed, when they never work together? And so looking at options to bring people together in ways that are safe but still allow for that,
Well, that sort of brings me very nicely onto the question I thought of, really. I mean, it was very interesting. That is that how are we looking at short term? That question I put down. Are we looking at short term solutions to make public spaces safer, or long term challenges which take into account function and well being? And its function, flexibility you have, function and well being. I mean, that's a quite major change in the inflexibility of workspaces and office environments we currently have, isn't it?
Yeah, Joe. I mean, the biggest thing that I'm seeing is that the side of the office space being an area for company community and culture to be transmitted out to the employees, but also be an area for creating shared experiences. And the reason a lot of people stay at the work where they are is either because they feel the culture is aligned to their own personal goals, or that they love the people they work with, or they know they have like-minded colleagues. And how do you build that on a virtual level? It's very difficult, and it's something that companies need to be actively doing, because it's something that will very quickly deplete. And how do you keep that feeling of team when you always had Thursday nights once a month you go out for drinks together, or you had Friday lunches together? Or how do you build that same feeling of being part of a community when you're not physically with each other? It's difficult, and it definitely takes detailed thought and going over to make sure you get it right.
And to that point, also hashing out a disagreement and opinion. Both you and Joe brought that up as well. There's the positive side of building and feeling like you're in that community, but there's also, Amy, if you and I disagree, we can discuss that in a way that doesn't necessarily have to feel contentious, and then we can have lunch, or we can hash it out, just the two of us, and then go back. Like, there are all of those interpersonal ways that, as you said, are about feeling like you're in a community, contributing to that community, feeling taken care of in that community, and then also people helping you feel like you're making good decisions together. That we've spent decades solving in person, and then no matter how much scenario planning you did, nobody thought about how to solve those elements of it in this capacity.
And it can be really difficult to get that level of, I guess it comes across more aggressive if you're having an argument over video, because even though you get the sort of gestures and it's much better than just audio, it's very different to being face to face with someone in a room. In the same way that trolling online happens, people are very confident behind their computers, but as soon as you're face to face with someone, your empathy levels go up, and you're more likely to be more in line with each other and able to reach a resolution. So again, It's making sure that people are trained in empathy in the workplace, and people are thinking about, okay, maybe that person on the other end of the video call is upset today because they had childcare issues, or they're having to look after a sick relative, or they're trying to balance all these different things that come with working from home during a pandemic. And it's encouraging people to think more empathetically in the workplace generally.
Yeah, and that context is what I've been really missing. That, like, when I was, needed to have a difficult conversation with someone in my team, or even just a normal conversation, but we wanted to stretch it a bit, I've normally seen them come into the office in the morning, and they've sat down, and I've seen whether they're smiling or whistling, or whether they came in late. And so I'm getting all these signals around how their day is going. Whereas now, I'm just checking into that call at 10:30, and I've got no context as to how their day has gone up to that point. And so I can choose to take the meeting for longer and understand that context, and then have the conversation I need to have, or just go straight into that, this deck wasn't good enough. These are the ways we need to make it better. But that's not very likely to land very well. But so now, and this is something we've been struggling with. So now does my day have to get longer? Because every meeting I need to understand some context. So every half an hour becomes 45 minutes. And so I need to work a 10-hour day just to do the same amount of stuff I was doing before. Is a real struggle for us. And we've been trying to work on some, well, how can we do that in more collaborative video, or can we do that over chat, or just can we figure out better ways to work together? But it's unsolved at the moment.
Well, the word that was mentioned earlier was communities, and I think if you're doing it online, then you'd have a community manager, wouldn't you? And I suppose if you're managing people online and different things, then you need to have someone separate who manages the well-being of the employees you've got on that network. I mean, essentially, you have a community in the workspace, you have a community at home. Home requires different handling, and therefore probably needs slightly a more personal approach to make sure everybody's okay, rather than put all the onus onto a meeting environment to check people are okay. Although you perceive and read so many things when you're talking to people you already know quite well. It's when you're having a business meeting fresh with people you don't know, do you have to then read all kinds of signals and try and use your experience to understand who these people are, how they're feeling, this, that, and the other, to all those things that you would see physically in the space. But it's a question of managing the whole community and using the appropriate tools for each of those communities, which clearly seem to be currently short-term anyway, morphing into one.
It's also, new when you have new employees that maybe you've never met face to face during the pandemic. They've been brought on board. They've only worked from home. How do you make them feel like they're part of a team, that they're a valued member of your team? How do you read them in the way that, Joe was saying, when you know someone and you've seen them in the morning? How do you do that if you've never met them in person? It's about looking at people. I think we used to very much have our professional selves and our home selves, and it was very easy to make that distinction because you go into an office and then you put on your hat for the day, and then you go home and you're a different person. But you can't do that anymore. Our home lives are around us. We can see things in the background of, you were having a conversation earlier about the bike in the back of Sam's room, and you can't ignore those things, and you see parts of people's personalities that maybe you wouldn't have seen just in the physical office space. And it's about having that more holistic view of management, but also of how you run your company. And when we go back into the office space, how will that then reflect the new changes in how we're working and how we have been working whilst at home?
And I think what to me is, in a moment of optimism about this moment, like these are fundamental human needs that have been there, for millennia. You know what I mean? That people need to feel seen, that people need to feel heard, that people need to feel like they matter, that people need to feel like they're part of a community. A community that excites them and values them. like these are the things we've been solving and confronting, and all of us in our personal lives have been needing more of and less of, and all of what we've been dealing with these issues forever. And I think now the variables are entirely different, but the effect is still the same. So to Clive's point, whether we call it a community manager, or there does still need to be that element of HR checking in on wellness, and many of us, as I think it was Vince who said, workplace analysis and wellness studies have been going on, for decades in this workspace. And now we're just adding new variables to it, but the essence of the needs are still the same. And then similarly, I think there's that, and then there's also the relational. So Joe, I've never met you. You don't know that I'm not in my apartment in Manhattan, that my wife and I are in the Catskills because it's October and we wanted to see the leaves turn. And we thought, well, it does no harm to just go away for 2 weeks. So there's this pillow with an E on the back that isn't mine, but you might be reading into that. But that we don't start in this way that like takes 30 seconds each person just to say, this is where I'm at right now, is kind of a thing that we did know how to do when you came to my office or I went to your office, that we don't really do in Zoom. And to your point, yes, you're taking an 8-hour day and making it a 10-hour day. Yes, the E is for electrosonic, Joe.
Well, human beings are amazing things, aren't they? But put into different circumstances, we do things naturally that we adapt to in an environment that we don't realize is happening. So our brain is assimilating things in a very different way and picking up almost unconsciously things that we don't realize it is, and therefore seeing things and perceiving things very differently. You can tell how different university.
And without the formality of like full-on affect labeling, but an ability for us to relate in a one-to-one or group level of saying, where are you at this morning, or where are you at this afternoon? And just asking that question saves you like 30 minutes of back and forth headbutting potentially in your meeting. So I think finding, the right ways of starting a conversation that way that make people feel seen and heard and feel like you're being seen and heard as well, that I think is the thing to help build and flush out. And that's, in our in-office designs, what we try to do consistently is make people feel like they matter. That's why we do interactivity so much. And trying to figure that out in this setting, it is a different thing, because it's not just, Darren and Vince and Sam all knowing our corporate culture, but knowing that you are actually defining that corporate culture back in that conversation. Figuring out how to do that virtually is, I think, the big question for us at this moment.
Can I just jump on the back of that very quickly, actually, but it's fully support that. I think it's worth actually highlighting a few positives as well that have come out of this situation. And I think we covered that on the last roundtable as well. We needed that step forward, or that catalyst to have these discussions and actually take a big step forward as an industry. And COVID's tragic, but it's done that. It's forced that innovative thinking. It's forced some of these human discussions to come higher up the agenda. But two positives that I take away is that innovation. The fact that we're talking about this and everyone is looking at things slightly differently means it's serious, and things will change. Maybe not at the pace we'd all like, and maybe we don't quite know the final direction yet, but every day is a step forward. But another aspect which touches on what we've spoke about here, the E on the cushion, the bike, actually people get to see the real people behind the companies. I probably never realised it before, but every time I go into a meeting room as Vince from CBRE, there's already a preconception about Vince from CBRE, because I'm from a massive brand. I've usually got a suit and a tie on, and I've never actually been myself, very, without putting an act on. But actually people do now appreciate the real people behind these companies. And a cushion, a bike, whatever it is a bit of a talking point. I once, kind of halfway through lockdown, we had a team quiz, and I done it from my hot tub, and it got a great laugh. I wouldn't probably do it to a client pitch, but for a team quiz, it was different, and it spurred on a little bit of a chat, and you know, people know that you're a real person behind the brand.
It's interesting. I mean, Peter was saying, are architects and consultants thinking about the workplace again, looking for installation solutions that support the needs for health and safety in meeting spaces? Is this something now firmly on the agenda for whatever we call a workspace when we return to it, if we return to it in whatever form we choose to? Do you think, Vince? Again.
Yeah, I guess as the project manager in the room, that's one for me. Yes,
you're the expert in this sort of stuff.
Yes, is the answer. I mean, health and safety has always been there, right? But actually, it's gone to a degree now where some people don't want to touch a door handle. They don't want to even log onto a keyboard. You know, so it's really, alongside everything that we're talking about here, there's been some great innovations in antibacterial surfacing, UV filtration on air conditioning, you name it, it's happening. Has anyone got the silver bullet yet to the perfect kind of COVID secure office? Not yet, but every day again there's steps forward. But it's definitely come very high on the agenda of facility managers, building managers, etc. on everything. I mean, it's amazing what we think about here. We've got the human aspect, the technology, the health and safety. There's a lot of spinning plates, if that's not too simple an analogy, to kind of come together. And again, I'll come back to my point. This is forcing innovation, and hopefully all these aspects which have always been spoke about independently will hopefully one day converge into, not perfect, because it never will be, but that close to perfect kind of working and home environment.
Darren, there's been a lot of investment in HE over recent years, the last couple of years certainly. People are now panicking they've got the environment right, or are they seeing expensive changes having to be made whilst all the students are off getting pissed in their halls of residence at the moment?
It's definitely a time for adaptation. That's definitely true. I think, like I mentioned earlier, there's universities that are still pushing ahead with development, still creating classrooms. We're working very closely with one particular one at the moment, and we've just finished a selection of summer rooms for them, just normal standard classrooms. We're actually in the process of sort of creating a 2-floored new building with just standard classrooms in them, and you know, they're sort of pushing ahead, building, I suppose, for the future, really, because, you know, this is obviously we need to adapt, and we need to make sure that the capacity control is in place in the buildings. There is certain ways in which to control the rooms, like I mentioned earlier, but there's also organisations that we're working with, I think, like I touched upon earlier, really, that have put the whole project on hold because the primarily process of the entire ethos of the building was collaboration. So it's interesting, but there's ways in which they can do that and still continue anyway, like I mentioned earlier. But yeah, a lot of investment is still going into, at the moment, it seems, in terms of some of the capacity control in some of the libraries, like the learning resources centres and things. Again, one of the universities that we're working with very closely has sort of created the sort of gates at the front. So as you walk in, they automatically read your university card, so they know you're within the building, and then they can also then calculate the capacity of that building under a 20% of the full capacity. And also, just from a reception point of view, you know, without having someone physically there to be within the building to increase that capacity, if you like, then there's also the invisible receptions as well that are also sort of produced out of QR codes and things like that. So a lot of universities seem to be putting those in as well, just so they can minimize the capacity within buildings and then maximize their student intake within the buildings as well, but obviously keeping within the minimal capacity that they can.
I wonder whether we were going to have a new tier developed here, which is like multi-interface monitoring that would cover all those sort of things that we had in a raw form in buildings regardless. I mean, you know, I know the GCHQ, we've got an amazing array of technologies. One of the colleagues I met had just spent the day there, and it's amazing what they had in place, you know, to spot before he'd entered the building just quite who he was, and God knows what else. I mean, positively frightening. I can see good and bad sides of that.
Yeah.
That could well be a new market for the AV fraternity, I suppose, depending what your background and technical thing is.
Yeah. There's some also technology out there as well at the moment that we've recently been introduced to that actually is monitoring the actual physical capacities of the rooms as well, and actually can communicate directly with the building managers and the security of the building. So if there's a meeting space that's normally a 6-person meeting space, but obviously has to be reduced down to 2, for example, now, then the technology can actually recognize that there is 3 people in that space, and actually then, create an alarm and send someone to the space in order to, make sure that additional person's not removed, but there is some awareness there that they are over capacity within that space. So the technology reliance is very much there, and in flow now, and also being invested in because of the current situation.
Do you feel privacy concerns coming up from clients in moments like that?
Yes, there is concerns for that, but the thing is, the technology that's in place, they're not facial recognitions as such, so they're not actually recognizing who the individuals are, if that makes sense. It's just purely on either a heat sensing element or they can sense that there's figures within the space and things like that, and also temperature control as well, which is an interesting point, because obviously if your temperature is above a certain amount, then that can be recognized by some of the technology, and again, an alarm can be created on that as well. So yeah, just from a privacy element, and that's not so much an issue with that particular technology.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that monitoring and so on was quite a growing area, where we discussed it earlier, well, sort of halfway through last year, about that being a way of estimating, measuring the value of a space and how we would monitor its use and so on. Now suddenly it's been jet propelled into another area, almost a monitoring now, which is incidental to its main function. Right. It's been put into the same basket almost, hasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, like you say, the monitoring side of things has always been there, but before, I suppose it was always about occupancy and how many people are going to be using that space over a 12-month period, and then obviously you can review that after the 12 months, and if it's being used 80% of the year, then you've got a good justification then for more expenditure or upgrades and things like that. But obviously, if it's being used 10% of the year by one particular person, then obviously you've got that data there to recognize just from a cost perspective. But obviously now the technology is being used, like you say, for other purposes, which is I suppose quite handy for the current climate.
I suppose both to Darren and Joe, really, how is this affecting AV supply? How it's being what's the word I'm looking for? Tenders for supply and so on. What are people now? Are they putting things on hold? Are they rethinking what they're asking for and how it should be installed, how it's being used, and everything else? I mean, just 10 levels of complexity virtually overnight now, and thinking how do people specify what they actually need now? Is that complicated, the tender process and the briefs to suppliers and installers? What about you, Joe? Have you amended the way you communicate with people?
So yes and no. Our model is we have some kind of fairly rigid standards that we employ across our kind of AV deployment, and so and we have very early, typically like stage 2 engagement, and we have an AV project manager on that all the way through until completion. So we're looking at what projects are in flight that we might want to change, but that's quite a big lift, and sometimes we don't yet know what we want to change it to. So perhaps we pause it, or we just deploy the known standard, and we might come and look at it again later. What teams are working very hard on is we're now at the point we're kicking off those projects that will complete the end of next year into 2022, where we think maybe the world will look a bit more normal, but it might be a different kind of normal. So people are working very hard on defining what are those standards to be. because we now have the opportunity to put those into projects without having to kind of have significant change later. Whereas the other end of the scale, we've got projects that we just completed that we've not even occupied yet, that we may be looking to change, and that's obviously reasonably costly.
Well, you've got a massive building program, haven't you, in New York and London? That really is. So you think of how the world's expanding and the Google plan of the next five to 10 years. I mean, it's incredible expansion plan. Has that been modified, presumably?
Even just broader than that, we've got, right now, probably got upwards of 400 active building projects. So New York and London are the showcase ones, but also, Bucharest, or little expansion in Stockholm and all across the US, significant expansion in Asia Pacific as well. So everything's being looked at, but also, there are lots and lots of different priorities for the business, and so expanding into new markets is still important. Having offices, having places where people can get stuff done, even if that stuff looks different, we still maybe need a place for that to be done. We're still hiring people, and those people still are going to need somewhere to work from, and maybe lab space, maybe, lots of our engineering teams need specific workstations for their software engineering work, and those need to be somewhere. So that's quite a kind of a messy answer to that question, but it's we still need buildings, and we still need them often in lots of different places. So everything's being looked at, but most things aren't stopping.
I mean, when I talk to the architectural community, they think nothing is really, this is not going to change anything. It's just going to make people think differently think more intelligently about the space they use and what they use it for. And, for the first time, and the office is a very old concept. I mean, it's God knows how long it is, but it's based on a very old model. And now, as Vince said, everything's speeded up. And now we're having to, think for the first time about what employees need. This overused phrase of collaboration is, what do we really mean by this? I mean, companies moving very quickly, doing things much more quickly, going through this massive era of digital transformation, and again, an overused consultancy phrase, that, this has brought into the digital natives right into the equation. Now, if you're a certain age, you are now, you've just now been bypassed. I mean, if you didn't know anything about technology over the past year, you're a bit stuck. And so for, the whole process of how we think, work, talk to each other, collaborate to actually get things done, and eventually just survive within a working environment, has not really been catered for in the way it should have been. And therefore, architecturally, it's still the same space. We need to think differently about it, think what functions we really need. All the stuff about monitoring and stuff should be within the fabric of this building, but it's the intelligence within it and how we use the space creatively to enable people to do things better and do them in a certain way that mimics the way they want to work. That element of flexibility, is very difficult to do. It's costly, probably. Some buildings won't be appropriate for it, and some companies won't have the expertise or imagination to make the best use of it. But I see the whole thing going on. And Andrew, what you were saying, we talked before, you seem to have put down almost like a prescriptive way of begin every design decision by thinking about the audience, who this is for, what experience do they need or want in the space, and so on. That sort of list I put down seemed to be quite appropriate for this, in that part 3, we're looking to create what I call the multidisciplinary experience, which is probably a hackneyed phrase, but I couldn't do any other way of describing it properly. Whether it's experience or not, I don't know. It's just probably it's a normal working environment. What's the new normal? We've expected staff to work in appalling environments up until now, and now we've been caught with our pants down. We need to up our act. This thing we had last week with Property Week really showed up just quite how well behind property owners and developers and those who rent out the space were behind the needs of their customers. It was the same old model being chucked out. Now they're having to rethink, and customers being made, those who rent out space, much more discerning about the space they use, what they want to get out of it, and what they're paying for. And I think all this has been thrown into the pot, which is precisely why we had that thing last week, to get these sides together, all these different elements of building services, architecture, AV, and so on, into the pot that it always has been in, but very separate channels that hasn't communicated. And AV has always been the last resort into the pack. So, I don't know why we start with this, but with your expertise as a designer and your amazing background of not just theatre but everything else around it, which is more than any other person I think I know, Andrew, I have to say. And that's the great thing about ESI Design. You've got it's an amazing company of architects, AV designers, everybody else in that pot of expertise. I don't think we have over here in a consultancy in the same way you have it. And it means that you've got expertise to draw on, but a good way of actually looking at all these elements and coming up with an interesting solution that seems appropriate. It's an approach to doing it, which is very difficult to have a clear brain about.
Yeah, one of the things, that to me I was really excited about, or sees a point of pride in my theatrical work, was that every show looked and felt completely different, because if you're doing the Scottish play or if you're doing Hamlet, that is completely different from, I don't know if Michael Moore is known over there, but shortly after the election of the current occupant of the White House, I did a piece with Michael Moore on Broadway where the show changed daily based on whatever was in the news, because, as you know, the news has a month's worth of stories in any given day these days. Same thing over there. Or, shortly before that election, I worked with a British playwright who we did a show called Privacy that started at the Donmar Warehouse in London and then came to the Public Theater in New York, that was all about privacy and sort of working with lawyers every day to see how far we could legally hack the audience in their phones and Wireshark and things like that, where there were terms and conditions when they bought their ticket. But it's all to say these shows looked and felt completely different. And with ESI Design, it's the same thing. We did the Statue of Liberty Museum and Warner Media that opened, and Major League Baseball's headquarters that all opened within 3 months of each other. And they all look and feel completely different because the culture of each place is completely different. And exactly as you said, Clive, we start by saying, who is the audience? What do they need? And sort of starting out with at the end of the day, like I said earlier, like the fundamental human needs are in essence the same. It's just the variables of what to highlight or what to lift up or what the space needs or how to lift that. Certain detail, I think, is the question and the exciting element of each project. What's kind of fun is to Vince's point, yes, that this pandemic is terrible. Millions and millions of people across the world are affected health-wise, economically. We can't and shouldn't discount that. And we do have this, I feel, moral obligation to think about how to make spaces safer and more inclusive, safer in every sense of the word, when we all come back together. At the same time, by being knocked so hard, it forces us to be present and to look at these questions and to think about what actually wasn't working, what were assumptions that we held on to forever. Like in the AV world, it's like, well, everything is based on Unix. Is that actually, like, we're based on that assumption for decades and we're sort of too baked in to really rethink it. And we've had these baked in assumptions forever in what office and public space designs are as well. And now we have this freedom to rethink it. So things like, gesture-based technology, or floor cameras, as Darren was saying, or heat-based cameras, doing interactivity that way. We've been playing in that space forever, but now we have this freedom to think a little more creatively and to speak with the Joes and the Amy's and the Vinces of the world to say, hey, this technology that I know it seemed like a leap before, but now it has all these benefits, and here's the R&D we've been doing with it. So things like, coming out of the UK, touchless haptics that we don't think it's ready for prime time, but we're really excited about this idea of, you know, what elements of interactive design beyond purely the visual or the touch can you get? Or what we did at Warner Media was we were mixing LiDAR in the Intel RealSense camera to give you the sense of multi-touch on a large LED wall, but where you don't have to physically touch the wall to get there, because it's just, you know, looking for multiple points in this one field anyway. So it was touchless, but with the interactivity model we're used to for touch screens. Or, you know, localized sound, which is not a new invention and keeps getting better, but these different ways of building certain experiences that you know are really helpful to explore in this post-COVID moment. And I think the imagination is unleashed in new ways. So it's not just, oh, we start to be able to question baked in assumptions, but now we can dive into these cool, new, exciting ideas and say, you know, we had this space in Hudson Yards and we had this 6-story open area. Instead of making this office space, you actually could build a sense of culture and a sense of how people come together if you build a giant video sculpture there that is interactive and reactive in real time and makes you feel like you're affecting the space and vice versa. And so these conversations that, you know, took giant leaps of imagination before, it's now easier to build this sort of thing because your audience is more receptive to that, right? You know, it's like Netflix ushered in a new way of watching television. This can usher in a new way of looking at the public space that we inhabit together. And then it all comes back to who are the people that inhabit the space? What are their needs? You know, everybody wants to be surprised in a given moment, you know, but managers hate the idea of surprise coming at them. So how do you build a space that makes it feel fresh every day when you come in so that you feel reinvigorated and enabled to make good decisions? And, you know, how do you reduce stress so that people make better decisions together and feel taken care of? And again, the variables are different, but the questions are the same as what we always do. And then it just becomes, okay, what is a way to make everybody's day just a little more, you know, welcoming, a little more beautiful, make somebody's morning routine something they smile about, not something they cringe over. And how do you do that both physically when people come back, or a lot of our offices, people are, you know, the work from home is the general policy. Some people are still coming into the office every day, even if it's, you know, very infrequent or only for an hour or two and then they leave. How do you still take care of those employees and those people? And then for museums, how do you stay open for when people need that escape as well?
In a sense, it's probably the nature of the work that's making people miserable, not the place they're working in. The two aren't always related, of course. I do wonder how companies are seeing this. I think, oh my God, they're thinking money here, a lot of expense, a lot of effort. Why bother have the office at all? You know, the more enlightened, bigger corporations who have professional departments to think about this and can therefore formulate a strategy where they can think more intelligently about how the environment in which their employees sit. I can imagine, you know, will be the next step on, and they will be the big providers and purchasers of AV and goodness knows what else, as they always have. What worries me slightly is the smaller companies upon whom we expect, you know, those are the ones that are going to grow into the bigger ones, and therefore with the customers of the future aren't even going to bother with this. So, oh, well, can't be bothered with all that. Let's keep more working remotely, perhaps pump a bit of effort into helping them improve their home environment. Let's not bother with the office. So, you know, what worries me slightly, you have these big mega environments that are amazing to work in, and then nothing else, rather than smaller environments, so that we're nurturing the AVs of the future, if you like. That's what worries me slightly.
And retail is, I think, an interesting model to look at, you know, where again, the question of is brick and mortar retail dead, you know, that's not a new question. And it has had to face serious questions. And you have, you know, the Harrods and the Marks and Spence and the Nordstroms and the Neiman's that, you know, these mega companies that can't afford to keep making unique in-store events. And then you have your small, you know, there's one shop, and it really becomes, you know, how do you find a way to make it low cost or highlight something that is unique? You know, like I was very, very lucky where before I joined ESI, I was for a time a resident designer for Tiffany and Company's flagship at Fifth Avenue, and I was also working for one of the tailors on Seville Row, and that both of them are all about inherited tradition, yet they embrace new technologies as a way to entice buyers in and give them something that, it almost social capital is the word we started using to discuss it, right? Some sort of, not an Instagram post or likes or follows, but something that makes you feel like you're gaining something from visiting that physical space, and finding a way. Even the most high-end retailers who I've worked with, not neither of those two I just mentioned, but all of them still, their margins for what they can spend in store are so tight that they were asking me to run things off of Mac Minis that they didn't even want to spend money on a bright sign, some of these retail spaces. So it was like, okay, you're charging on average $10,000 per item and you're making me use an old Mac Mini. This is terrible. But you still had to find a creative solution to do that thing. And I think for the AV industry, the more that we come together and demystify, and I'm not saying, spec Mac Minis for every project, but I think, we have our Crestron based system and we have our Disguise D3, media server setups that can be reactive and work with Notch and Unreal and all of these things. But at the same time, I think we almost owe it to the world to think about tighter, more efficient systems that do run on bright signs or lower cost playback systems, just to keep the conversation going so that these smaller companies that can only afford a certain amount right now, we can still give them something today that then in 5 or 10 years, when we find what a new, better hybrid model is, then we can give a more fuller, fleshed out system. But I think we owe it to be malleable at this moment for smaller companies.
I think in line with what you said and what Clive was saying in terms of cost, it doesn't necessarily have to be that major installation or that brand new office. It's about going right back to the beginning of what Andrew said and thinking about who is using the space, how they use that space, and how you could make their use of that space a little bit easier or a little bit lighter. And actually that doesn't have to be a high cost thing. It might not even be new technologies. It might just be unlocking a different way of using that technology to make that day a little bit easier or a little bit smarter or a little bit quicker. And I think we've always talked about end users and making things easy to use and user experience. Those things are not new concepts, but I think we are still going in and we're talking to the CTOs, or we're talking to the very experienced technical teams about what they want. And we're not talking to the people that are using those spaces every single day to say, okay, talk me through your working day and how you would use this space. And I think it just gives people a fresh perspective on how that technology could work better for them, whether it's newly installed or reimagined.
We're talking. Sorry, Vince, go on.
No, I was just going to kind of jump on the back of that it's an interesting concept. And Andrew, you're 100% right. Let's think about the audience. Me as a project manager, I sit here thinking, right, who is that audience? And there's several audiences, actually. You've got Sandra, who sits on reception, but we're talking to the CTO. There's a massive gulf in between, but they're both the audience. When you kind of look at it kind of top down from a property perspective, that occupier, that tenant is the audience to the landlord and the developer. And we've not really even touched on we started to touch on the building aspect of this before we even think about fitting out an office. So there's an audience at every level. And I think we were kind of getting to here, and maybe Clive was going to drag us there now, was the building aspect of this, which again, this is pushed on a little bit of innovation in developers, landlords, to think of their audience, which is tenants and occupiers. And one thing I think we're all aware of, it's far more expensive in terms of time and cost to do things retrospectively. To think about it now, up front in new developments or refurbishments, whatever it may be, or a relocation, now is the time, and I think we can all definitely agree on that. So this again has completely shifted are starting to shift mindsets. I think at an interiors level, Andrew, you and your fraternity have been there for a long time. I think the AV industry has been pushing for this. Now it's getting people's attention because it's costing time and money, and they want to make their buildings, experiences, you know, attractive to everyone.
Yeah, it's approaching the projects in a completely different way now. You know, it's the, like you were saying, it's the bigger picture, it's the whole experience rather than, you know, just those components like technology and things like that. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The pressure is really on developers and landlords. That's where the pressure really is. When you think about it, and actually, out of that kind of that property life cycle, those are the guys that where arguably the big money is, and they build what people want. You know, they're should be far closer to that requirement. But I think that they've probably been caught in the headlights a little bit as well, to be honest.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, and they, you know, I don't know the London scene as well. In New York, you know, typically the landlords, they would want to entice you to drive up value of their building, right? Or, you know, if a new capital venture purchased one building from someone else, they'd want to increase that value. But generally speaking, in Manhattan, there will always be tenants for any space, generally speaking, right? Whether it's apartment rentals or, you know, office space tenants, there would always be that. And now I think exactly as you said it, Vince, it's like, oh, they're caught suddenly having to figure out how to incentivize in a way that they didn't quite have to before. In New York, I think could always rely on that, whereas a project we're doing in Vancouver, you know, Vancouver is now building up new offices in really exciting ways, and biophilia and all of these workplace benefits, interior, exterior, you know, how to attract. I think Google is building an office there. I know Facebook is, I know Apple is, and they're figuring out how do they attract these sorts of tenants. And so now they are including us, where as you said, you know, we would always come in at the very end and go, oh shit, I hope you ran conduit before you poured concrete to where we need it, because otherwise that's going to limit what we can do. And now we're actually involved, you know, from the very beginning, not in every project, but in a lot more. I think for ESI design, we benefited where we just went through a merger with the company NBBJ, which is a large architecture firm. And so we're not exclusively on projects that they're the architect of record on, but for the projects where they are, it's really beneficial because now we are like quite literally involved in day one. And so we can really say our system wants this, and we know that in 15 years it'll need to upgrade this way. And we don't know what it'll be in 25 or 50 years, but we know that these pipelines need to be built and engineered early on now.
Well, the interesting thing there is your manager, you're just almost like a project manager between for the client, don't you? Make sure all the different elements from audio to visual to goodness knows what else are integrated properly. And that's been the problem, I think, with the building side of things, because you know, it's been almost like a hierarchy, and the outside perception is, although, you know, I don't think it's been that brutal. It's been that no one talks, and it's a hierarchy of getting the building up, and everything else is a bit of a second, you know. And the more complex and sophisticated buildings are, the more down the hierarchy you are, because they've got to meet that deadline, and that's it, and you fit in that little end bit. Whereas the AV side had quite the opposite view. In fact, you know, to these, there's no such thing as a smart building. It's a bunch of automated functions that go within the structure. But the true intelligence, or what companies really need within a building, is intelligence to allow them to operate in a more sophisticated way, deliver function and service to their employees. And that's intelligence. And the building itself is a mere infrastructure, no matter how well and beautiful it looks. And believe me, in London, we've got some amazing architecture going on, and incredible buildings. How the hell they built them, I really don't know. But, you know, inside this, you expect a much more sophisticated, intelligent environment than, as far as I've seen anyway, that they're getting. I'm not sure that's going to change, but it's making people more aware of perhaps what their tenants need, because they're doing all this work themselves. And I think I would expect more of a closer match, unless you own the building and you're the tenant, to make things work together and make sure these these individually siloed environments, respectable and good though they are, actually operate much more closely. But people's commercial imperatives are so different, aren't they, Vince? It's difficult to get everybody together unless you're on top there, driving it down with a top consultant, and you're seeing all these strands from above.
Yeah, it really is.
And the great thing was a shard. We had there was Enzo Piano, fantastic architect who could really connect you with the project manager in there. Got the audio. We were looking with DJ Wilrich and a variety of other people. And it was a good thing from top down out. Now they've mucked it up with all kinds of bloody cocktail bars and everything else, and they've screwed part of the vision. But it was part of a much nicer, well-architected environment around London Bridge that seemed to really gel. And the one example I was seeing where everything seemed to flow better than it would otherwise do, but that was through to the enlightened architect, in my view. Piano is brilliant with that, and that flowed nicely through. I just wish everybody could do that, really, but I appreciate other commercial imperatives don't allow it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I spoke about on the last roundtable, which is often overlooked, if I'm honest. It's just how that natural property cycle and what the drivers are. At very, very high levels, a large developer, a large landlord, institutional landlords, they've got a very different strategy to how they go about things, and a different timeline, different funding issues. Where does the money come from? Is it foreign money? Price of lending, etc., etc. It gets very macro. But having said that, the smarter ones are coming around. They are thinking more strategically and long term about the end, not the end user they're getting there, but the end product and what it means to the market and wherever that may be. But as I've said last time, developers, landlords, and agents have got a big part to play in this, because an agent, with respect, doesn't always have this kind of detailed level of conversation. They're talking upstream and they want to get a transaction done. Whatever that transaction is, it's then for us to figure it out and make it happen. And that does compress costs or budgets, should I say, and it does compress time. I now hope and think, maybe not in the next 6 months, but 2 years down the line, the developments that are on the desk right now, hopefully those people are asking, right, how do I attract my audience, to use Andrew's term, that type of tenant? What are they going to want? They're going to want a COVID-ready or a COVID-secure office, because that's what the market needs. Well, how does that change my infrastructure? How does it change my timeline and my funds? Do I need to borrow more money to put more backbone into it? And I hope to God that those conversations are happening now. And then we can actually kind of get on board with that a bit more and join some of the dots we've been talking about.
Seems a big hill to climb, that, Vince, myself, being Mr. Cynical.
Sorry, say that again, Clive?
It seems a bit of a bigger hill to climb, that, being Mr. Cynical.
No, Mr. Realistic, I would probably call it.
That's good.
It is a bigger hill to climb, because I think the way that there's two distinct parts to this industry. There's investment and money and building buildings, and then there's actually using them on the occupier basis. And we're kind of on this occupier side. But the fine line between them is very, very fine. And without occupiers, landlords and developers don't have anyone to occupy the buildings, and vice versa. So they've got to start thinking with that end goal in mind, and they are getting there. They've been getting there for years, to be honest. But now I think we've got a different motivation behind it, and it will affect that different end product. So a mountain to climb, yes, but I think it's one that's got to happen.
So can we come out of this then with any kind of particular vision for different spaces like collaboration, retail, meeting, and so on? Any sort of best practice approaches, any kind of rules of thumb that we could probably start to think of that could apply to different spaces at all from people's personal experience?
Build everything out of copper. Done.
Yeah.
Funny you should say that. Yes, exactly what I've been saying here, funnily enough. But there you go.
I think. Sorry, I was just going to say. I think flexibility is something which is maybe a bit obvious, but we're seeing huge benefits from the flexibility that we built into some of our offices a few years ago, and the flexibility that we didn't build into some other offices. It now makes huge difference to what we can offer to people. The fact that we can change the size of a meeting room, or we can change the width of a corridor or something in some of our spaces, is now particularly relevant, because it means it changes how people can operate and kind of move in a space.
Yeah, I think ensuring standards as well, that a lot of people now have standards in place, but ensuring that those reach as far as the people that are working from home, to make sure that whether someone's in an office, working from home, traveling, whatever the future may hold, that the same standards are applied across the board, and that if you're at home, you're not left sort of behind the pack, so to speak, to the people that are in the office, because you don't have the same collaboration tools or the same chance of being as productive as those that maybe are in a physical workplace.
I think I would, if I was to design the perfect roadmap here and now, which I'm going to attempt to do, actually. It's nothing that we've not already spoke about, but I think we're going to be in a world where, you know, flexibility is key. But in order to enable that, you need, for me, 3 key components. You need the right infrastructure in the first place, whether that be building or, you know, the on-floor infrastructure. The technology, which we're all talking about and debating now, which is thankfully taking steps forward. But you need the ability to flex. And what I mean by that is, you know, give it 2.5, 3 years time, hopefully, don't know, when we've forgot about COVID, and then everyone's doing the opposite. We're putting people back into the office, where we're having shorter desks, we're putting more people in again. But then another pandemic comes, we need the ability to go, right, we've got the solutions, we can ramp up the air, we can send X people home because the infrastructure's there already. We can kind of breathe with whatever happens and whatever life throws at us. That's the holy grail. And if I had to kind of put a pen to paper and try and design my office, if I was going to do that, that's what I would be looking for.
It's funny enough, it was an audio guy, funny enough, 5 years ago, John Mary, said, well, what about this workspace then? He said, well, don't fret about the technology, just think about what you want to use the workspace for and work back. And that was 5 years ago, one of my second interviews with him, and it's quite interesting. I thought, well, no one else has come up, and actually the audionist has done not a bad job actually adapting to the infrastructure of buildings more than any other. But I do wonder how the AV industry generally, you know, is dealing with multifunctionality, and is it flexible enough to supply what we need, you know, new office environments to provide for us?
I think, you know, to combine Joe and Vince's point on flexibility, I think, you know, Joe is exactly right that that's what we need, and Vince is exactly right that you can only really do that if you build the infrastructure to support that from the beginning. And one of the approaches we do at ESI Design is really we think about a fully bespoke playback system and CMS. So whether it's a box machine that we customize with our own playback software, or we use, you know, something like Disguise is a formal media server, but with our own CMS that's customized to the client in the end. The idea being, no matter what screen we use, we can swap it out for LED. You know, we're exploring light field displays now, a lot of really exciting stuff, but it's all built to be flexible so that the system is at the same time coherent and changeable. And that flexibility, because we build things to be permanent, and nobody knows what the world will look like 10 years from now, but you don't want to hire us to build something that's irrelevant in 2 years. So that flexibility has to be a part of the infrastructure from moment one. To Amy's point, I think she's exactly spot on that it's about having these standards and setting those standards across the board. I think the one thing I'd add is expressing what those standards are up front. So when you come into the public space, in an invitation that's not didactic, it doesn't have to be, a sticker on the floor telling you this is what we're doing, but some way of informing you what our standards are or inviting you in. And then I think in addition, really making sure you feel a part of a culture or a community, and that there's something, whether it's subtle or overt, whether it's text-based or just designs meant to evoke a certain set of emotions or reactivity meant to show you are imprinting on the building itself. Ways to make sure that the community you're entering and that you feel like you are a part of it and shaping it as well. I think that community element is for us pretty essential.
Definitely.
It's interesting. I know VIX is moving towards these standards. We had Greg doing a presentation last week, actually. It seems there's more cohesiveness that VIX are looking at the moment. But who's controlling these standards? I mean, does it, when you think about infrastructure, is it IT going to be taking hold of that and CIO? Or is this going to be a strategic thinking thing? When you're talking infrastructure, with a whole building organization and so on, you are talking CXO level, aren't you? Where does that leave AV, and where does AV's input into various standards go? I mean, when you're looking at Bloomberg, you've got an AV and an IT role in one now, Jeff was in fact his sponsor was a CIO at the time, which is how he's really sort of gone and done great things at Bloomberg. But it is that kind of organization that lends itself better to this sort of thing. I do wonder, actually, how strategic, what level of strategy is this going to do to make standards effective, and who's going to be controlling them, and who's going to ensure they're implemented in a balanced way.
And how do we pin that down early enough? I'm sure you've all been on the same projects where once you're actually installing and it's finally dust free, the tiniest things you end up arguing about whose scope that is and whose responsibility and who you're answering to. And, the more you do this, the more you realize how essential it is to pin that down early on and pin down who on the final end client side, who exactly you're answering to, like who the key stakeholders are. But I think you're right that client to client, project to project live, like it must be pinned down early on for this project, and then overall, who is really thinking about strategically what we're all putting out across your entire company or corporate culture. Because otherwise, if it's all satellite based to a certain degree, you don't have those standards that Amy's saying we need.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the people. If you involve the people of the company and that community and that culture from the very beginning, those standards are almost self-actualizing. If people are working towards standards that they believe in, they identify with, that work for them, it's not something you need to reinforce. It's a natural part of the culture that happens on a day-to-day basis, and the technology just aids that. It's about the technology not necessarily being the focus of the day or the meeting or the room. It's about it aiding people to do their job better, easier, happier, and just being there to support it rather than being the focus of it.
I would, exactly that. One probably harder kind of aspect to this, which is a very boring aspect, but is business continuity. Now, when an incident happens, call it a pandemic, call it a terrorist attack, call it all of that horrible stuff, and I'm going to touch my breakfast bar here, which is wood. Businesses are forced to react very quickly. And there was a few businesses that learned a lot of lessons over this because they didn't really have continuity plans, or they did and they failed because they just didn't look after them properly. So if there's ever an operational kind of driver behind promoting some of these thoughts, it's business continuity, especially when it comes to financial institutions, tech firms, etc. What happens when the next emergency occurs? Right, we've already got a model in place. We've thought about the technology. the softer human aspects, etc. And we can almost push a button and then we kind of move into business continuity mode. That's the holy grail. I don't think that's there 100% for any business. I think some are probably closer than others. But that should be another facet for us in this group to push this agenda. You know, business continuity is important. Let's think about it at the very start.
Okay. Well, I think we've probably run our course a bit, actually. Good place to stop. Would anyone else like to add anything to this? I could go on for another half an hour, but I don't want to see people falling off their seat. It's been an hour and a half, remarkably. I mean, I love these sort of conversations because they fly by, don't they? They really want to get into it. And this is such a massive topic that's so changing and so complex. It's very difficult to know just what direction to take and develop. And, you know, I'd like to know more about the services you're offering and so on. But, you know, that's probably something that David could explore later, actually. But I don't want to take up too much of your time. Joe's had to go as well. He's got something at Google he needs to attend to. So I don't want to over-egg the pudding. And this is our first time we've done this. I want to time it right so people are just are not over-exhausted by it all. It's quite an intense process, actually, looking at each other, doing it interactively like this rather than a much more casual way in a room. But I rather do hope that it's not been too taxing for you all and everything else. So it's I try and keep
really
it.
interesting.
Oh, it's been very good, been very interesting.